Bear Cub got stuck with the fallen tree in the river. What he did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The gentle melody of birds echoed through the dense forest as the morning sun filtered through the canopy. Gentle rays of light danced on the flowing river that cut through the wilderness. The water sparkled like diamonds, rushing over smooth rocks and fallen branches. Near the riverbank, a small brown bear cub named Rusty played in the soft mud, his tiny paws leaving imprints as he chased after butterflies. Rusty's mother, Clara, watched him from a short distance as she dug for roots and berries. Her protective eyes never strayed far from her curious cub. Rusty was only 4 months old, his fur still fluffy, and his eyes wide with wonder at the world around him. Clara huffed softly, turning over a fallen log to search for grubs underneath. "Stay close to the bank, Rusty," Clara growled softly. "Don't go near the deep water." Rusty barely heard her warning. His attention had fixed on a bright blue butterfly that fluttered just out of reach. The little cub bounced on his hind legs, trying to catch the beautiful insect between his paws. The butterfly danced away, leading Rusty closer to the edge of the river. Not far from where the bears foraged, a group of hikers made their way along a trail that ran parallel to the river. There were 5 of them: Noah, Lily, Marcus, Zoe, and their guide, Harper. They had started their trek at dawn, eager to explore the hidden beauty of Pinewood National Forest. "This place is incredible," Lily whispered, her camera clicking rapidly as she captured the scenery. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and excitement shone in her green eyes. "I've never seen such untouched wilderness." Noah nodded in agreement, adjusting his backpack. "Harper, are there many bears in this area?" he asked, glancing nervously at the dense forest around them. Harper, an experienced wilderness guide with 10 years under her belt, smiled reassuringly. "Yes, but they usually avoid humans. As long as we make enough noise and store our food properly, we shouldn't have any problems." Marcus, tall and athletic with a red beard, walked ahead of the group. "I'd actually love to see a bear," he said with a grin. "From a safe distance, of course." Zoe rolled her eyes at her brother's comment. "Be careful what you wish for," she muttered, pushing her glasses up her nose. None of them knew that just around the river bend, young Rusty was about to face the greatest danger of his short life. The massive storm that had swept through the forest 2 nights ago had uprooted an old oak tree. The tree now lay across a narrow section of the river, creating a natural bridge. Its thick branches dipped into the rushing water, catching debris that floated downstream. The fallen giant had created a dam of sorts, causing the water to pool and swirl around its trunk. Rusty, still following the blue butterfly, spotted the fallen tree. Curiosity overcame caution as he approached the massive trunk. The butterfly landed on the bark, its wings opening and closing slowly. Without hesitation, Rusty scrambled onto the tree trunk, his claws digging into the rough bark for balance. Clara had wandered a bit further away, distracted by a patch of sweet berries hidden among the bushes. She didn't notice her cub venturing onto the dangerous natural bridge. "Look at this," Rusty thought to himself, as he carefully placed one paw in front of the other. The sensation of being suspended above the rushing water made his heart race with excitement and fear. The river looked different from up here, wilder, faster, scarier, but the butterfly was still ahead, tempting him forward. Just as Rusty reached the middle of the fallen tree, a sudden gust of wind blew through the forest. The butterfly took flight, disappearing into the trees. Rusty stood on his hind legs, trying to spot where it had gone. The movement caused the tree to shift slightly under his weight. A loud crack echoed through the forest as one of the branches supporting the tree snapped. Rusty tumbled forward, losing his balance. His right hind leg slipped between two branches, wedging tightly in the splintered wood. Pain shot up his leg as he tried to pull free. Panic flooded through his small body. Rusty let out a high-pitched cry, calling for his mother. But Clara was too far away, the sound of the rushing river drowning out her cub's desperate calls. Rusty pulled and tugged, trying to free his trapped leg, but it only made the pain worse. Tears welled in his eyes as he whimpered, fear taking hold. The river's current grew stronger around him, splashing cold water onto his fur. The tree groaned and shifted again, threatening to roll further into the deeper water. Rusty's cries grew more frantic, his small body trembling with fear and cold. Meanwhile, the hikers had stopped for a quick break about 100 yards downstream. They sat on large rocks, drinking water and enjoying the peaceful sounds of nature. None of them could hear the desperate cries of the trapped bear cub over the rushing water. Harper checked her map, planning the rest of their journey. "We should reach the waterfall by midday," she said, tracing their route with her finger. "It's one of the most beautiful spots in the entire forest." As the hikers repacked their bags and prepared to continue, Zoe paused, tilting her head. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, frowning slightly. "Hear what?" Noah asked, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "I thought I heard, I don't know, like a crying sound," Zoe replied, her eyes scanning the forest around them. Marcus laughed. "Probably just a bird or something." Harper shook her head. "Actually, let's listen for a moment." She raised her hand, signaling everyone to be quiet. In the silence that followed, a faint cry carried on the wind, the desperate sound of a creature in distress. "That's not a bird," Lily whispered, her eyes widening. "That sounds like—" "A bear cub," Harper finished, her expression turning serious. "And where there's a cub, there's a mother," Noah said, fear creeping into his voice. What no one yet realized was that Rusty's situation was growing more dire by the minute. The river's current pushed against the fallen tree with increasing force, causing it to shift again. Water now reached Rusty's belly, the cold seeping into his bones. His cries grew weaker as exhaustion set in. Clara, finally noticing her cub's absence, began searching frantically. She sniffed the air, catching Rusty's scent leading toward the river. Panic surged through her as she charged through the underbrush, branches whipping against her massive body. Time was running out for little Rusty. The tree groaned once more as the current tugged at its branches. In his fear and desperation, the cub was about to do something that would shock everyone who witnessed it, something that would test the limits of his will to survive. Rusty's heart pounded against his tiny ribcage as the cold water rose higher around him. His fur, now soaked and heavy, clung to his small frame. The pain in his trapped leg had turned to a dull throb, and a dangerous numbness began to spread through his body. The little cub shivered violently, his eyes blinking against the spray of water that occasionally splashed over his face. Through his fear, a new feeling emerged. Determination. Some ancient instinct, passed down through generations of bears who had survived the harshest wilderness, awakened within him. Rusty stopped struggling for a moment and looked at his trapped leg. The branch that held him was thick, but it had splintered where it caught his leg. Small cracks ran along its surface, weakened by the constant pressure of the water. With a focus unusual for such a young animal, Rusty leaned down and began to gnaw at the branch. His small teeth worked at the wood, scraping away tiny pieces. It was slow, painful work, But he persisted, driven by the will to live. Meanwhile, Clara had reached the riverbank, her massive paws skidding in the mud as she frantically searched for her cub. The scent trail led her to the spot where Rusty had climbed onto the fallen tree. She roared in distress when she spotted her cub trapped in the middle of the river. Without hesitation, she plunged into the shallow water, but the current immediately pushed against her large body, nearly knocking her off her feet. "Rusty!" she bellowed, her voice carrying over the sound of the rushing water. "Hold on, my little one." The cub looked up at the sound of his mother's voice, hope flickering in his eyes. "Mama!" he cried weakly, his teeth still working at the branch between attempts to call for help. Clara tried again to reach her cub, pushing deeper into the river, but the water quickly became too deep, the current too strong. She roared in frustration, pacing along the bank, looking for another way to reach her baby. Farther downstream, the hikers had decided to investigate the sounds they'd heard. Harper led the group cautiously along the river, keeping a safe distance from the water's edge. "Remember," she warned, "if we do encounter a bear, especially a mother with cubs, we need to stay calm and slowly back away. No sudden movements, no running." Noah swallowed nervously. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see a bear charging at them. "Something's in trouble," Zoe insisted. "We can't just ignore it." As they rounded a bend in the river, they froze at the sight before them. About 50 yards upstream, a massive brown bear paced anxiously along the riverbank. In the middle of the river, a small cub struggled on a fallen tree, partially submerged in the rushing water. "Oh my God," Lily whispered, instinctively raising her camera before thinking better of it and lowering it again. "Back away slowly," Harper instructed, her voice barely audible. "The mother bear is distressed, which makes her extremely dangerous." But as they began to retreat, Marcus spotted something unusual. "Wait," he said, pointing. "Look at what the cub is doing." Through her binoculars, Harper watched in astonishment. It's biting at the branch," she said incredulously. "It's trying to free itself." "Can bears do that?" Noah asked. "I mean, do they have that kind of problem-solving ability?" "They're intelligent animals," Harper replied, her professional interest temporarily overriding her caution. "But this is exceptional, especially for one so young." Zoe's eyes darted between the struggling cub and the distraught mother. "We have to help," she declared suddenly. "Absolutely not," Harper said firmly. "It's too dangerous. That mother would tear us apart if we got anywhere near her cub." "But it's going to drown," Zoe argued, her voice cracking with emotion. "Nature can be cruel," Harper replied softly. "We can't interfere, it's not our place." Marcus, who had been quietly assessing the situation, spoke up. "Maybe we don't have to get close," he suggested. "What if we could create a distraction or change the water flow somehow?" Before they could discuss this further, a new sound echoed through the forest, the mechanical rumble of an engine. The group turned to see a green pickup truck bouncing along a narrow service road that ran parallel to the hiking trail. It stopped about 100 yards away, and a man in a forest ranger uniform stepped out. "That's Ranger Daniel," Harper said with obvious relief. "He patrols this section of the park." Harper waved her arms, catching the ranger's attention. He approached quickly, his expression serious as Harper explained the situation. "I've been tracking that mother and cub for weeks," Ranger Daniel said, reaching for his radio. "She's a first-time mother, very protective but inexperienced." He called for backup, requesting emergency wildlife rescue personnel. "Is there anything we can do?" Lily asked. Daniel assessed the situation through his own binoculars. "That tree is barely stable. If it shifts again, the cub could be pulled under. He reached into his truck and pulled out a long coil of rope. "I'm going to try something, but I need you all to stay back. Way back." As the humans formulated their rescue plan, Rusty continued his desperate effort to free himself. His jaws ached from the constant gnawing, but he had made progress. The branch was weakening, small pieces breaking away under his persistent attack. Still, it wasn't enough. The water had risen higher, now reaching his shoulders. His movements became sluggish as hypothermia began to set in. Clara, sensing her cub's fading strength, grew more frantic. She tested the water again and again, each time forced back by the powerful current. In her desperation, she began to drag large branches to the river's edge, as if trying to build her own bridge to reach her cub. It was a futile effort, but maternal instinct drove her to try anything. Meanwhile, a dark figure moved silently through the trees on the opposite bank. A large male wolf, lean and gray with piercing yellow eyes, had been drawn to the commotion. Wolves rarely attacked bears, especially adults, but a vulnerable cub could be potential prey. The wolf, a solitary male named Shadow, who had been separated from his pack during the storm, watched the unfolding drama with hungry interest. Shadow crept closer to the edge of the forest on the far bank, staying downwind to avoid detection. The mother bear was so focused on her cub that she hadn't noticed the predator's arrival. The wolf calculated his odds, eyes fixed on the struggling cub. If the tree shifted and the cub fell into the water, he might have a chance to grab it when it washed downstream. Back on the near bank, Ranger Daniel had formulated a risky plan. "The cub is too far out to reach safely, and that mother won't let us anywhere near," he explained to the hikers. "But I might be able to secure the tree, prevent it from rolling further into the current." "How?" Marcus asked. Daniel uncoiled his rope. "I'm going to try to loop this around the root end of the tree and anchor it to shore. It won't free the cub, but it might buy us time until the wildlife rescue team arrives." Harper nodded in understanding. "What can we do?" "Keep an eye on the mother bear," Daniel instructed. "If she charges, yell to warn me, then get in your vehicles or climb a tree." As Daniel moved carefully along the bank, approaching the fallen tree from downstream to stay as far from Clara as possible, the situation suddenly became more complicated. The wolf on the opposite bank made a strategic error. He moved too quickly, snapping a twig beneath his paw. The sharp sound cut through the noise of the river. Clara's head jerked up, her nose twitching as she caught the wolf's scent. A deep, threatening growl rumbled from her chest as she spotted the predator. She was now faced with an impossible choice: stay to protect her trapped cub from this new threat, or continue her efforts to rescue him from the river. The wolf froze, aware he had been spotted. He lowered his head slightly but didn't retreat. Two predators locked eyes across the river, a standoff that ratcheted the tension to an unbearable level. Rusty, unaware of this new danger, continued his desperate gnawing. The branch had weakened considerably, small fibers of wood giving way under his persistent effort. Then, just as the wolf took a tentative step forward and Clara roared a warning, something unexpected happened. The tree shifted again, but this time in a direction no one anticipated. Rather than rolling deeper into the river as feared, it rotated slightly on its axis, causing the branch trapping Rusty to crack further. The sudden movement sent a sharp pain through the cub's leg, but it also widened the gap where his limb was caught. Sensing the change, Rusty gave one final, desperate tug. With a splintering sound that was lost in the river's roar, his leg came free. Freedom was momentary. The cub immediately lost his balance on the slippery trunk. He scrambled for purchase, his claws scraping against the wet bark, But it was no use. With a frightened yelp, Rusty tumbled into the rushing water. Clara bellowed in horror as her cub disappeared beneath the surface. On the opposite bank, the wolf tensed, ready to move downstream to intercept potential prey. Ranger Daniel and the hikers watched in shocked silence as the small brown head vanished in the churning current. For a heart-stopping moment, Rusty was gone from view. Then, a few yards downstream, his head broke the surface. He gasped for air, his tiny paws paddling frantically against the powerful flow that carried him ever faster away from his mother, toward unknown dangers downstream. What happened next would astonish everyone who witnessed it, human and animal alike. It wasn't just Rusty's immediate actions that would prove shocking, but the chain of events his struggle would set in motion. Events that would forge unlikely alliances and reveal the extraordinary lengths to which all creatures will go when faced with life's most desperate moments. Rusty's small head bobbed above the surface of the rushing water, his paws thrashing wildly as he fought to stay afloat. Each breath was a desperate gasp, water splashing into his mouth and nose. The current spun him around, disorienting the small cub as he was swept downstream. The cold had numbed his body, but panic kept him fighting. Clara charged along the riverbank, her massive form crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. Her eyes never left her cub's struggling form. She roared continuously, a sound of such raw anguish that it sent birds scattering from the trees. On the opposite bank, the wolf made his decision. Shadow darted downstream, his lean body a blur of gray as he kept pace with the floating cub, his hungry eyes calculated, waiting for the perfect moment to strike if the young bear washed ashore on his side of the river. "The cub's in the water," Noah shouted, pointing as Rusty's small form was carried past their position. Ranger Daniel abandoned his rope plan and sprinted back toward his truck. "Follow the cub downstream," he yelled to the hikers. "Don't lose sight of it." The group ran along the path, their hiking gear bouncing as they struggled to keep pace with the rushing river. Harper, the most athletic of the group, took the lead, her experienced eyes scanning the water for any sign of the small brown head. "There," Lily pointed, her voice breathless from running. About 30 yards ahead, Rusty had managed to grab onto a rock that jutted from the middle of the river. His small paws clung desperately to the slippery surface, the current tugging at his body like an unseen hand, trying to pull him back into its grasp. Ranger Daniel reached them, breathing hard. "The rescue team is 20 minutes out," he said grimly. "That cub doesn't have 20 minutes. The rock Rusty clung to was surrounded by rushing water too deep for him to stand in, but it created a small eddy on the downstream side. As they watched, the exhausted cub made a decision. Rather than continuing to fight the current head-on, he let go of the rock and allowed himself to be pulled into the slower-moving water of the eddy. "Smart cub," Harper murmured with newfound respect. In the eddy, Rusty found he could paddle more effectively. His natural instincts took over as he dog-paddled toward the nearest shore, which happened to be the side where the wolf waited. Clara saw the danger before the humans did. She let out a warning bellow and without hesitation plunged into the river upstream from her cub. The powerful current immediately caught her much larger body, but she used her weight and strength to angle herself toward Rusty. The wolf, seeing both bears now in the water, retreated slightly into the tree line but didn't leave. He watched, yellow eyes gleaming, as the drama continued to unfold. Rusty had nearly reached the bank when he spotted the wolf's shadowy form among the trees. Instinctive fear gave him a burst of energy, and he changed direction, paddling frantically back toward the middle of the river. "No!" Zoe cried, as if the cub could hear her. "The current's too strong there." Sure enough, as soon as Rusty left the protective eddy, The main force of the river caught him again. He tumbled helplessly, disappearing beneath the surface once more. Clara let out a roar of desperation as she fought her way through the water, powerful legs churning against the current. She was gaining on her cub, but still several yards away. Ranger Daniel had reached his truck and was pulling out what looked like a long pole with a loop at the end. A capture snare used for wildlife rescue. "If the cub comes close enough to this bank, I might be able to reach it," he called to the hikers. "But that mother's going to be a problem. She'll see it as a threat." Marcus, who had been staring intensely at the river, suddenly pointed to a spot about 50 yards downstream. "Look at that fallen tree," he shouted over the noise of the water. "It's created a natural dam. If the cub washes into that, it might get trapped again, but it could also be a chance to rescue it." Indeed, another large tree had fallen across a narrow section of the river, its branches creating a maze of wooden barriers that caught debris floating downstream. If Rusty washed into it, he might have a chance to grab hold, but there was also a risk of him becoming trapped underwater and drowning. As if hearing their discussion, Rusty's head broke the surface again. He had been tumbled and spun by the current, but was still conscious and fighting. The cub spotted the tangle of branches ahead and seemed to understand both the opportunity and danger they presented. With the last of his strength, he angled his body, trying to control his approach to the natural dam. Clara, too, had seen the obstacle ahead. She changed her trajectory, swimming powerfully to intercept her cub before he reached the dangerous tangle of wood. On the shore, a new voice called out, "We've got a boat. Let us through." 2 more rangers had arrived, carrying a small inflatable rescue boat between them. They quickly began to prepare it for launch, but it was clear they wouldn't be ready in time to reach Rusty before he hit the fallen tree. What happened next left everyone speechless. As Rusty approached the tangle of branches, he didn't simply allow himself to crash into them randomly. Instead, the small cub made a deliberate choice. He aimed for a specific gap between 2 large branches, a space just wide enough for his small body to pass through, but too narrow for most debris. It was as if he had assessed the structure and found the safest passage. "That's impossible," Ranger Daniel muttered, watching through his binoculars. "Bears are smart, but that level of problem-solving." With perfect timing, Rusty slipped through the gap in the branches. The current immediately slowed on the other side of the natural dam, creating a pool of calmer water. The exhausted cub paddled weakly toward a cluster of branches that formed a kind of platform just above the water's surface. Clara, seeing her cub navigate the obstacle, tried to follow the same path, but her much larger body couldn't fit through the gap Rusty had used. She crashed into the branches, the impact nearly submerging her. For a terrifying moment it seemed she might be pinned underwater by the current. But Clara's strength was formidable. With a tremendous heave, she pushed against the branches, breaking several with loud cracks. She forced her way through the barrier, splintering wood and creating a new opening in the dam. The structural integrity of the entire natural dam suddenly came into question. The tree shifted, branches groaning under the pressure of the water and the bear's massive weight. "It's going to break," Harper shouted. "If that whole dam gives way, it could create a surge downstream." Ranger Daniel grabbed his radio. "We need to evacuate anyone downstream," he said urgently to his colleagues. "That dam could go at any minute." Meanwhile, Rusty had reached the branch platform and pulled himself up, collapsing in exhaustion. His small body trembled uncontrollably, his fur matted and dripping, but he was alive and for the moment out of the water. Clara, having broken through the dam, swam powerfully toward her cub. The relief in her movements was palpable as she reached the same cluster of branches. However, as she tried to climb onto them, Her weight caused the already damaged structure to shift ominously. The wolf, who had been following along the bank, suddenly froze. His ears perked up, head turning toward the forest behind him. A moment later, he darted away, disappearing into the trees. "Something spooked the wolf," Marcus observed. Harper nodded. "There might be other predators nearby, or maybe—" Her words were cut off by a deep, rumbling growl that echoed through the trees. It wasn't Clara's voice. This sound was deeper, more threatening. Emerging from the forest on the far bank was an enormous male bear, nearly twice Clara's size. His dark fur was streaked with gray around the muzzle, and a prominent scar ran across his right eye. He moved with the confident swagger of an apex predator at the height of his power. "Magnus," Ranger Daniel breathed, recognizing the infamous bear that had been the subject of research and tracking for years. "He's the dominant male in this territory." Magnus surveyed the scene before him: the broken dam, the trapped female, the vulnerable cub. His intentions were impossible to read, but his presence changed the dynamics of the situation dramatically. Clara positioned herself between the male and her cub, her motherly instinct to protect overriding her exhaustion. She growled a warning, though she was clearly no match for the massive male in her weakened state. The humans watched in tense silence, unable to intervene in this wild drama. The rescue boat was ready, but no one dared to launch it with Magnus now on the scene. The huge male bear ambled closer to the water's edge, his eyes fixed on Clara and Rusty. Then he did something completely unexpected. Instead of challenging them or retreating, Magnus began to use his massive paws to dig into the muddy bank, creating a trench that connected to the river. "What is he doing?" Zoe whispered. Ranger Daniel shook his head, baffled. "I've never seen anything like this." As they watched, Magnus continued to excavate, creating a channel that began to divert some of the river's flow away from the main current and the damaged dam. The water level around the branch where Rusty lay began to drop slightly as some of the pressure was relieved. "He's helping them." Lily's voice was filled with disbelief. "Not intentionally," Ranger Daniel replied, though he sounded uncertain. "Bears dig for food or to create resting spots. This is probably just coincidental." But as Magnus continued his methodical work, the purpose behind his actions became harder to dismiss. The channel he created was reducing the water pressure against the damaged dam, potentially preventing a catastrophic collapse that would endanger all three bears. Clara seemed as confused as the humans. She maintained her protective stance, but watched the male's actions with wary curiosity. Rusty, having recovered slightly, raised his head to observe the massive bear that was inadvertently or deliberately coming to their aid. The rescue team took advantage of the situation. With Magnus occupied with his digging and the water level dropping, they carefully launched their small boat. Moving slowly to avoid startling the bears, they approached the damaged dam from downstream. What no one expected was Rusty's next move. The cub, seeing the humans approaching in their boat, made a decision that defied all natural instinct. Instead of retreating in fear, he deliberately moved away from his mother's protection, climbing higher on the branches to make himself more visible to the rescuers. Clara growled anxiously, trying to call her cub back to her side, but Rusty held his position, his behavior showing an almost uncanny understanding of the situation. It was as if he somehow knew the humans represented his best chance at complete rescue. "I've never seen anything like this," one of the rescue rangers murmured as they carefully maneuvered closer. "It's almost like he wants to be rescued." Ranger Daniel, watching from shore, shook his head in amazement. "This cub has done the impossible at every turn. First gnawing at the branch to free himself, then navigating the dam, and now this. It's extraordinary. As the boat inched closer, Magnus finally seemed to notice the human presence. He stopped his digging and raised his massive head, nostrils flaring as he caught their scent. Everyone held their breath, waiting for his reaction. The enormous bear stared at the boat for a long, tense moment. Then, with a dismissive huff, he turned and ambled back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as suddenly as he had appeared. With Magnus gone, the rescue team could focus fully on Rusty and Clara. Using long-handled nets and the capture snare, they prepared to attempt something rarely tried: the simultaneous rescue of both a bear cub and its mother from a dangerous water situation. What happened in the next 30 minutes would become legend among wildlife rescuers, and would forever change how the scientific community viewed bear intelligence and behavior. It would also forge an unexpected connection between species that were typically adversaries, revealing that in nature's most desperate moments, the divisions between predator and prey, wild and tame, could blur in ways that defied explanation. As the rescue boat edged closer to the branch platform where Rusty waited, Clara made her own shocking decision, one that would leave even the most experienced wildlife experts questioning everything they thought they knew about bear behavior. The rescue boat rocked gently in the current as the two rangers aboard it carefully maneuvered toward the trapped bears. They moved with practiced precision, their faces tense with concentration. One ranger, a woman with short gray hair and weathered skin named Ranger Elaine, readied the capture pole, while her younger colleague, Ranger Thomas, steered the boat. "Easy now," Elaine murmured, her eyes never leaving Clara's massive form. "Mama Bear is watching every move we make." Indeed, Clara had risen to her full height on the unstable branch platform, her eyes locked on the approaching humans. She swayed slightly, the branches creaking ominously beneath her weight. Rusty remained separated from his mother by about 6 feet of damaged wooden dam, perched on his own clump of branches. On shore, Ranger Daniel kept the hikers well back while maintaining radio contact with the rescue team. "Clara's been spotted in this territory for 3 years," he explained quietly to the group. "She's never shown aggression toward humans, but a mother protecting her cub is unpredictable." Zoe couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene. "What if the mother attacks the boat?" she asked. "That's why they're approaching from the side where the cub is positioned," Daniel explained. "They'll try to create a situation where the mother has to choose between attacking the boat or staying with her cub." The boat inched closer to Rusty, now less than 10 feet away. Clara let out a warning growl, her lips pulling back to reveal long, sharp teeth. The rangers paused, holding position. "We need to give her time to make a decision," Elaine said into her radio. "She's smart enough to understand we're a threat, but she might also realize we're the cub's best chance." What happened next stunned everyone watching. Rusty, who had been quietly observing the approaching boat, suddenly made a deliberate move. He carefully climbed down from his perch and, to everyone's astonishment, began to move along the broken dam toward the boat, not away from it. Clara let out an anxious huff, shifting her weight as if to follow, but the branches beneath her cracked warningly. She froze, caught in an impossible situation, unable to follow her cub and unable to retreat to shore without swimming through the still dangerous current. "The cub is approaching the boat," Elaine reported, her voice tense with disbelief. "I've never seen this behavior before." Rusty stopped at the edge of the branches, now about 5 feet from the boat. He looked back at his mother, then at the humans, then down at the churning water between them. "He wants to be rescued," Tomas whispered, voicing what everyone was thinking but afraid to believe. Elaine slowly extended the capture pole, the looped end hovering just a few feet from the cub. In normal rescue operations, this would be the moment when the animal typically retreated in fear or lashed out defensively. Everyone held their breath. Rusty studied the pole, his head tilting slightly as if considering it. Then, in a move that defied all wildlife behavior protocols, he tentatively moved closer to it. "This is unprecedented," Ranger Daniel murmured from the shore, watching through binoculars. "Complete violation of natural instinct." Clara growled again, louder this time, clearly distressed by her cub's behavior. The branches beneath her shifted again, water sloshing over some of the lower ones. Her precarious position was becoming more dangerous by the minute. Elaine seized the moment. With expert precision, she slipped the loop over Rusty's head and around his upper body, then gently tightened it. The cub squirmed slightly but didn't panic or fight as most wild animals would. "I've got him," Elaine confirmed. "Bringing him in now." With gentle pressure, she guided Rusty off his branch perch. There was a moment of resistance as the cub's paws scrabbled for purchase, then he slid into the water. Elaine quickly pulled the pole, drawing the cub toward the boat. Thomas reached out with a thick towel, catching Rusty as Elaine lifted him from the water and immediately wrapped him to prevent hypothermia. Clara roared, the sound echoing across the water. It was a cry of distress rather than aggression, a mother watching her baby being taken by creatures she had been taught to fear. She shifted on the branches, causing the entire structure to list dangerously to one side. "The dam's going to collapse," Ranger Daniel warned over the radio. "You need to get clear, now." Thomas started the boat's small motor, beginning to back away from the failing dam. Rusty, now secured in the boat, let out a high-pitched whine, straining toward his mother. Clara made her decision. With a desperate lunge, she abandoned the branch platform and plunged into the current, powerful legs propelling her toward the shore. But she didn't head for the far bank where she had been before. Instead, she swam directly toward the human side of the river, where Ranger Daniel and the hikers stood watching. "She's coming this way," Noah exclaimed, backing up reflexively. "Hold your positions," Daniel ordered, though his own hand moved to the tranquilizer gun at his hip. "Don't run. It triggers predatory instinct." Clara reached the shallower water, her paws finding purchase on the riverbed. She emerged from the river, water cascading from her fur, and stopped. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, caught between her fear of humans and her desperate need to follow her cub. The rescue boat had reached the shore about 50 yards downstream. Elaine and Thomas carefully lifted the wrapped bundle that was Rusty and carried him toward their truck where emergency wildlife care equipment waited. Seeing her cub being carried away, Clara made her choice. She began to follow, maintaining a distance of about 30 yards from the humans, but clearly intent on staying with her baby. "She's following us," Thomas reported into his radio. "Let her," Daniel replied after a moment of consideration. "As long as she keeps that distance, we'll consider this a dual rescue." For the next 20 minutes, a remarkable procession moved through the forest. The rangers carrying Rusty led the way, followed at a respectful distance by Ranger Daniel, the hikers, and finally, Clara herself. The mother bear never approached too closely, but never fell too far behind, her eyes fixed on the bundle that contained her cub. At a small clearing where the rangers had set up a temporary wildlife assessment station, Rusty was placed on a folding table. The veterinarian who had arrived with additional backup quickly examined him. Mild hypothermia, some abrasions on his trapped leg, exhaustion, but no life-threatening injuries, the vet reported. "This little guy is extremely lucky." Throughout the examination, Clara remained at the edge of the clearing, occasionally huffing or shifting anxiously, but never charging or showing aggression. It was behavior so unexpected that the wildlife experts present found themselves exchanging baffled looks. "I've worked with bears for 20 years, the vet said quietly to Ranger Daniel. "I've never seen a mother tolerate humans handling her cub like this. It goes against everything we know about bear behavior." Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on Clara. This entire situation has been one impossible event after another. First, the cub's problem-solving with the branch, then its navigation of the dam, now the mother's behavior. Once Rusty had been treated, warmed, and determined to be out of danger, the wildlife team faced a difficult decision. Protocol dictated that the cub should be taken to a rehabilitation facility, particularly since he had shown such unusual comfort around humans, a potentially dangerous trait for a wild bear. "If we separate them, the mother will likely try to follow wherever we take him," Elaine pointed out. "She's already demonstrated she'll go to extraordinary lengths for this cub." After a brief consultation, the wildlife team made an unprecedented decision. They would release Rusty at the edge of the clearing and observe what happened, ready to intervene if necessary. The vet carefully unwrapped the cub and placed him on the ground at the edge of the clearing closest to where Clara waited. For a moment, Rusty seemed disoriented, wobbling slightly on his paws. Then he spotted his mother and let out a happy chirp. Clara responded with a soft huff of recognition. The cub bounded toward her as fast as his tired legs could carry him, nearly tumbling over himself in his eagerness. The reunion between mother and cub brought unexpected tears to the eyes of several hardened wildlife professionals. Clara gently nuzzled her baby, sniffing him thoroughly as if checking for injuries. Rusty pressed against his mother's leg, his entire body wiggling with joy. Then Clara did something that left everyone speechless. She raised her head and looked directly at the humans gathered across the clearing. For a long moment she held their gaze, her intelligent eyes seeming to convey something beyond animal instinct, something that felt remarkably like gratitude. Without warning, a familiar large shape emerged from the trees behind Clara. Magnus had returned. The enormous male bear stopped several yards away, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Nobody move," the vet whispered, though no one had been planning to. To everyone's amazement, Clara didn't immediately flee with her cub or position herself protectively in front of Rusty. Instead, she stood her ground, watching as Magnus slowly approached. The big male stopped a few feet away, towering over both Clara and her cub. Rusty, showing none of the fear one would expect, actually took a tentative step toward Magnus. Clara made no move to stop him, though she watched vigilantly. Magnus lowered his massive head, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the cub thoroughly. Then he gently nudged Rusty with his nose, almost like a greeting. The interaction lasted only moments before Magnus raised his head, gave one last look at the gathered humans, and turned back into the forest. Clara and Rusty followed, the small family disappearing among the trees. The clearing was silent for several long moments after the bears departed. "Did we just witness what I think we did?" Marcus finally asked, his voice hushed with awe. Ranger Daniel slowly holstered his tranquilizer gun. "I'm not sure what we just saw," he admitted, "but I don't think any of us will forget it." Later that evening, as the hikers warmed themselves around a campfire at a designated camping area several miles from the rescue site, they tried to make sense of the day's events. "The ranger told me they've been tracking Magnus for years," Harper explained. "He's never shown any interest in cubs before. In fact, male bears often kill cubs that aren't their own. They think he might actually be Rusty's father." "That would explain why he helped them at the river," Lily said, scrolling through the remarkable photos she'd managed to capture. but not how the cub knew to chew through the branch, or to navigate the dam, or to approach the rescue boat. Zoe stared into the fire, its flames reflecting in her eyes. "Maybe we underestimate what animals are capable of," she said softly. "Maybe there's more awareness there than we give them credit for." Noah, who had been the most skeptical throughout, nodded slowly. "I always thought wildlife rescue was about saving animals from themselves," he admitted. "But today it felt more like, I don't know, cooperation? Like we were all working together somehow." "Whatever it was," Marcus added, poking the fire with a stick, "I'm just glad the little guy made it. At one point, I really thought he was done for." As the hikers drifted into contemplative silence, none of them noticed the pair of yellow eyes watching from the darkness beyond their campfire. Shadow, the lone wolf, had tracked them from the river, his natural wariness of humans overcome by intense curiosity about these creatures who had intervened in what should have been a natural tragedy. Dawn broke over the forest with fingers of golden light stretching through the canopy. A light mist hung over the river, giving the landscape an ethereal quality. In a small hollow beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak tree, Clara and Rusty slept peacefully, their bodies curled together for warmth and comfort. Rusty was the first to wake, his small eyes blinking against the morning light filtering through the roots. The events of the previous day had exhausted him completely, but young animals are resilient, and after a night of deep sleep, much of his energy had returned. He nuzzled his mother gently, eager to begin a new day of exploration. Clara woke more slowly, her body still aching from the desperate swim and the emotional trauma of nearly losing her cub. She licked Rusty's face affectionately, checking him over with motherly concern. The leg that had been trapped showed some bruising and stiffness, but the cub could put weight on it without too much discomfort. A good sign that no lasting damage had been done. The small family emerged from their shelter into the misty morning. Clara immediately began to forage, overturning rocks and rotting logs in search of grubs and insects to replenish her strength. Rusty stayed closer to his mother than usual, the previous day's adventure having taught him a valuable lesson about wandering too far. Unknown to the bears, they were being observed. High in the branches of a nearby pine tree perched a woman with a camera equipped with a long telephoto lens. Dr. Amelia Chen, a wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior, had been alerted by Ranger Daniel about the extraordinary events at the river. She had arrived late the previous night and set up her observation post before dawn, hoping to document any unusual behaviors in the aftermath of the rescue. Through her lens, she watched the interaction between mother and cub with professional interest. "Normal post-stress behavior," she murmured into a small voice recorder. "Mother exhibiting typical protective patterns. Cub showing slightly increased dependency, but otherwise normal activity levels." As she continued her observation, a movement at the edge of the small clearing caught her attention. The massive form of Magnus emerged from the trees, his presence immediately commanding attention even from her distant viewpoint. "Male has returned, Doctor." Chen whispered excitedly into her recorder. Subject identified as Magnus based on distinctive scar pattern. This is highly unusual behavior for a male bear, showing repeated interest in a cub not during mating season. Clara noticed Magnus almost immediately. She straightened, positioning herself slightly in front of Rusty, but her posture wasn't aggressively defensive, as would be typical when a male approached a cub. Instead, she seemed cautious but accepting of his presence. Magnus approached slowly, his massive head swinging from side to side as he surveyed the area. He stopped about 10 feet from Clara and Rusty, sitting back on his haunches in what almost appeared to be a deliberately non-threatening posture. What happened next caused Dr. Chen to nearly drop her camera in astonishment. Rusty, after a moment's hesitation and a glance at his mother, bounded toward Magnus with the playful enthusiasm characteristic of bear cubs. Instead of warning her cub away, Clara simply watched, her posture alert but not alarmed. Magnus remained still as the cub approached, neither encouraging nor discouraging the interaction. When Rusty reached him, the tiny cub reared up on his hind legs and placed his front paws against the massive bear's chest, looking up at him with what could only be described as curiosity. "Extraordinary," Dr. Chen breathed, her camera clicking rapidly to capture every moment of the interaction. "This contradicts everything we understand about male bear behavior toward unrelated cubs." After allowing the cub's inspection for several moments, Magnus gently nudged Rusty with his nose, then rose to his full height. He turned and began to amble toward the river, pausing after a few steps to look back at Clara and Rusty, as if expecting them to follow. Clara hesitated, her head tilting slightly as if considering the invitation. Then, to Dr. Chen's continued amazement, she huffed softly to Rusty, and the pair began to follow the large male. "They're moving together as a family unit," Dr. Chen narrated, struggling to keep her professional detachment. "This is unprecedented behavior for bears that aren't in a mating relationship. Magnus is acting in what could almost be described as a paternal role." She quickly packed her equipment and began to follow the bears at a safe distance, careful to stay downwind and out of sight. The unusual bear family made their way to the river, but not to the section where Rusty had been trapped. Instead, Magnus led them to a wider, slower-moving portion about a quarter-mile upstream. At the riverbank, Magnus demonstrated something remarkable. He waded into the shallow water and, with expert precision, began to scoop at the water with his large paws. After several attempts, he flipped a good-sized fish onto the bank. He repeated this process 3 more times until a small pile of fish lay on the shore. "He's fishing for them," Dr. Chen whispered in disbelief. "Adult bears don't typically provide food for cubs that aren't their own." Clara and Rusty approached the pile of fish. The mother bear took one for herself, while Rusty pounced on a smaller fish with clumsy enthusiasm. Magnus watched them eat before taking a fish for himself, the 3 bears sharing a meal in what looked remarkably like a family breakfast. As Dr. Chen continued to observe and document this extraordinary behavior, her satellite phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. Keeping one eye on the bears, she answered in a hushed voice. "Dr. Chen?" "It's Ranger Daniel. We've got a situation developing that might be connected to your bears." "What kind of situation?" she asked, immediately concerned. "The storm that hit a few days ago caused more damage than we initially thought. There's a logging company that had equipment positioned near the North Ridge. They're claiming some of it was damaged by flooding, and they need emergency access to remove it before it causes environmental contamination." Dr. Chen's brow furrowed. "What does this have to do with the bears?" "The access route they want to use cuts right through the territory, where Clara and her cub have been living. Magnus, too, for that matter. The noise and activity could drive them out of their established feeding grounds, and with the cub still young. That could be disastrous." Dr. Chen finished his thought. "Cubs need consistent food sources to build up strength. If they're forced to relocate, particularly after the stress of yesterday's events—" "Exactly. The company has permits for the area, so legally they're within their rights. But I thought you might want to document the bears' behavior now, before any disruption occurs. It might help us make a case for an alternate access route." "I'm already on it, Doctor," Chen assured him. "And Daniel?" "There's something else you should know. I'm seeing behavior between these bears that contradicts everything we understand about male-cub interactions. Magnus isn't just tolerating the cub, he's actively providing for him. Almost like a father, Daniel suggested. It sounds crazy, I know, but yes, exactly like that. I need more time to observe them, to document this properly. It could change our understanding of bear social structures. I'll do what I can to delay the logging company, Daniel promised, but I can only hold them off for a day or two at most. As the call ended, Dr. Chen looked back at the bears with renewed concern. The small family had finished their meal and were now engaged in what could only be described as play. Magnus had rolled onto his back, and Rusty was clambering over his massive form, while Clara watched from a few feet away, occasionally joining in with gentle wrestling moves. The scene was so peaceful, so contrary to everything known about typical bear behavior, that it seemed almost magical in the morning mist. The thought that this rare dynamic could be disrupted by human activity filled Dr. Chen with both scientific and personal distress. Meanwhile, at the North Ridge, a convoy of heavy equipment was already being assembled. Jackson Timber Company owner Victor Jackson stood beside his mud-splattered pickup, looking at a map spread across the hood. He was a hard-faced man in his 50s, with calloused hands and eyes constantly calculating costs and profits. "We need to get that harvester out before the hydraulic fluid leaks into the watershed," he told the park ranger who had been assigned to monitor their emergency access. Environmental disaster waiting to happen. Ranger Melissa Wong nodded, though her expression remained skeptical. "And there's no other access route possible. The path you're proposing goes through sensitive wildlife habitat." Victor folded the map with deliberate movements. "Look, I'm not the bad guy here. We had all the proper permits for the equipment placement. No one predicted the storm would cause a minor landslide that would damage our machinery. Now, we're trying to prevent environmental damage by removing the risk." "I understand," Ranger Wong replied carefully, "but there's been a significant wildlife situation in that area. We have a mother bear with a young cub." "Bears can relocate," Victor cut her off. "My company will lose hundreds of thousands if that harvester isn't recovered and repaired quickly. Not to mention, if it does leak fluid into your precious watershed, I'll be the one paying the EPA fines." Melissa's radio crackled, and she stepped away to answer it. Victor took the opportunity to gesture to his foreman, a burly man named Mike. "Get the crews ready to move at first light tomorrow," he said in a low voice. "I don't care what wildlife drama these rangers are obsessing over. We have permits, we have rights, and we have a business to run." Mike nodded, glancing toward Ranger Wong, who was still engaged in her radio conversation. "Boss, maybe we should at least ask what the wildlife situation is. If it's something that could cause problems." "Like what?" Victor scoffed. "A bear's going to sue us? Look, the PR department can handle any tree hugger complaints. Just make sure the crews understand. We move quickly, we get in and out efficiently, and we don't engage with protesters if any show up." Unbeknownst to either the timber company or the rangers, another player had entered the complex situation. The lone wolf, Shadow, had been following the unusual bear family since dawn. His initial hunger had given way to a deeper curiosity about these bears that defied normal behavior patterns. Wolves and bears were traditional enemies in the wilderness, competing for territory and occasionally preying on each other's young. But Shadow, separated from his pack, was operating outside normal wolf social dynamics. His solitary status had made him more observant, more adaptable, and perhaps more open to the unusual. As the day progressed, Shadow maintained his distance but continued to observe the bear family. When they moved, he followed. When they rested, he found a vantage point to watch from. It was as if he was studying them, learning from their interactions in ways that transcended typical predator behavior. By mid-afternoon, Dr. Chen had accumulated hours of remarkable footage and detailed notes on the bear's behavior. She was particularly fascinated by Magnus's apparent teaching behaviors. At a muddy bank, he had demonstrated to Rusty how to find turtle eggs buried in the soft earth. Later, he showed the cub how to strip bark from a specific type of tree to expose the insects living underneath. This goes beyond occasional tolerance or even protection, Dr. Chen dictated into her recorder. Magnus is actively engaged in what can only be described as parental investment behaviors. This fundamentally challenges our understanding of male bear involvement in cub rearing. As the sun began to descend toward the western horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, the peaceful observation was interrupted by a distant mechanical sound. The bears immediately reacted, their heads rising in unison, noses testing the air. Dr. Chen recognized the sound of ATVs. The logging company's advance team was likely scouting their access route for the next day's operation. The bears clearly heard it too, and their reaction was immediate. Magnus rose to his full height, head swiveling toward the sound. Clara quickly gathered Rusty close to her side. For a tense moment, it seemed the bears might flee, separating and destroying the unique family unit Dr. Chen had been documenting. But Magnus did something unexpected. Instead of running away from the mechanical sounds, he deliberately moved toward them, his massive form disappearing into the thick underbrush. Clara hesitated, clearly torn between following Magnus and protecting her cub by retreating. After a moment's indecision, she huffed at Rusty and began to follow Magnus, keeping her cub close to her side. "They're moving toward the human activity," Dr. Chen whispered in disbelief. "This contradicts all expected avoidance behaviors." She hurriedly gathered her equipment and followed, keeping a greater distance now that the bears were on the move. The forest grew denser as they approached the north ridge, making it harder to track the bears without getting dangerously close. Eventually, Dr. Chen was forced to proceed by sound alone, carefully following the occasional snap of branches that indicated the bear's passage. The mechanical sounds grew louder, voices now accompanying the rumble of engines. Through the trees, Dr. Chen could make out a small clearing where 2 ATVs were parked. 3 men in Jackson Timber Company uniforms stood looking at maps and equipment. From her position, Dr. Chen couldn't see the bears, but she sensed they were close. Moving carefully from tree to tree, she tried to locate them without exposing herself to either the bears or the timber company workers. A sudden commotion erupted from the clearing, shouts of alarm and the revving of engines. Dr. Chen quickly raised her camera with its telephoto lens to see what was happening. Magnus had emerged from the forest at the edge of the clearing, his enormous form presenting an undeniable challenge to the human intruders. He wasn't charging or showing aggressive behavior, merely standing at his full height, a silent sentinel at the boundary of his territory. The men scrambled for their vehicles, their faces pale with fear. One dropped his map, another fumbled with his radio, frantically calling for assistance. The third managed to start his ATV, the engine roaring as he prepared to flee. What happened next would become the subject of debate among wildlife experts for years to come. As the ATV engine revved louder, Clara emerged from the forest as well, positioning herself next to Magnus. And between them, small but unmistakable, stood Rusty, the 3 bears presenting a united front against the human intrusion. "Impossible," Dr. Chen breathed, her camera clicking rapidly to capture the scene. "This is coordinated behavior. They're acting as a defensive unit." The timber company workers didn't wait to analyze the behavior. With shouts of fear, they roared away on their ATVs, leaving behind scattered equipment in their haste to escape. As the mechanical sounds faded into the distance, the bears remained at the edge of the clearing for several long minutes, as if ensuring the intrusion was truly over. Then, with what almost looked like satisfaction, Magnus turned and led Clara and Rusty back into the depths of the forest. Dr. Chen leaned against a tree, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the images on her camera's display. What she had witnessed went beyond unusual behavior. It suggested levels of cooperation and strategic thinking that current science did not attribute to bears. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Dr. Chen made her decision. This wasn't just about protecting a unique bear family anymore. What she was documenting could revolutionize our understanding of animal cognition and social structures. She needed to bring in additional observers, additional documentation, and she needed to stop the timber company's planned operation before it destroyed this unprecedented opportunity for scientific discovery. With renewed determination, she began the long hike back to the ranger station, unaware that she was being followed. Shadow, the lone wolf, had observed everything: the bears, the humans, the confrontation. And in his mysterious wolf cognition, connections were forming that would add yet another extraordinary dimension to an already remarkable story. The ranger station buzzed with unusual activity despite the late hour. Dr. Chen had arrived just after sunset, her research equipment slung over her shoulder, and her expression intense with purpose. Word had spread quickly about her observations, drawing together an impromptu council of park personnel and wildlife experts. Ranger Daniel stood at the center of the small crowd, his weathered face serious as he studied the photographs Dr. Chen had uploaded to the station's computer. The images showed Magnus, Clara, and Rusty standing together at the edge of the clearing, a united front against the human intrusion. "I've been tracking bears in this park for 12 years, Daniel said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this. Males occasionally tolerate cubs, but this level of apparent coordination..." Dr. Chen nodded emphatically. "It goes beyond tolerance. Magnus is actively protecting and teaching the cub. And that confrontation with the timber company scouts wasn't random. They deliberately moved toward the human activity and presented a unified defensive posture." Ranger Wong, who had returned from her assignment with the timber company, leaned forward to study the images more closely. "Are we certain this isn't just anthropomorphizing, assigning human motivations to what could be coincidental behavior?" "Fair question," Dr. Chen acknowledged. "But I've documented similar interactions throughout the day. Magnus has been demonstrating feeding techniques, showing the cub how to find specific foods, even appearing to stand guard while Clara and Rusty rest. These are teaching behaviors typically only seen between mothers and cubs." The station's senior wildlife biologist, Dr. Patel, stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "The scientific implications are enormous. If male bears can form these kinds of bonds with cubs that aren't from their current mating season, it challenges our fundamental understanding of ursine social structures. Not to mention the coordinated response to human intrusion," Daniel added. "That suggests levels of communication and cooperation we haven't documented in bears before." Ranger Wong sighed, bringing the conversation back to immediate practicalities. "Jackson Timber is planning to move heavy equipment through that exact area starting at 7 a.m. tomorrow. They have the permits, they have legitimate environmental concerns about their damaged harvester, and they're not going to delay because of interesting bear behavior, no matter how unprecedented. Then we need to find them an alternative route," Dr. Chen insisted. "This isn't just about protecting these specific bears anymore. This is a unique scientific opportunity that could advance our understanding of animal cognition." I've already suggested alternative routes, Wong replied, frustration evident in her voice. Victor Jackson rejected them all as too costly or time-consuming. He's not interested in scientific discovery, he's interested in his bottom line. Dr. Patel, who had been quietly contemplating, finally spoke up. What if we approach this from a different angle? Instead of trying to stop the timber operation, what if we use it as an opportunity to document how this unusual bear family responds to a significant environmental disruption? The suggestion was met with mixed reactions. Concern from those primarily interested in protecting the bears. Interest from those focused on the scientific aspects. We could set up remote cameras along the planned route, Doctor. Patel continued. Position observers at safe distances. Document everything from initial response through adaptation. It could provide invaluable data on problem-solving and family coordination in bears. Dr. Chen frowned, torn between scientific curiosity and concern for the bears' welfare. It's risky. The disruption could cause the family unit to break apart. Magnus might abandon the cub if stress levels get too high. Or, Dr. Patel countered, we might document unprecedented collaborative adaptation strategies. Science sometimes requires us to observe rather than intervene. The debate continued late into the night, with valid points on both sides. Eventually, a compromise was reached. They would continue attempts to convince the timber company to alter their plans while simultaneously preparing to document whatever happened if those attempts failed. As the meeting dispersed, Ranger Daniel pulled Dr. Chen aside. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. One of our trail cameras caught footage of a wolf following your bears. Dr. Chen's eyebrows rose in surprise. A wolf? Hostile? Daniel shook his head. That's the strange part. The wolf is keeping its distance, not showing hunting behavior. It's almost like it's observing them. A lone wolf? Yes, identified as one we've been tracking since the storm. Separated from its pack, young adult male. We've been calling him Shadow. Dr. Chen absorbed this new information with growing excitement. First, the unusual bear family structure. Now, a wolf showing atypical behavior in relation to bears. Daniel? That entire section of forest is exhibiting behavioral anomalies that defy everything we understand about these species. Daniel nodded grimly. All the more reason to keep the timber company out, but I'm not optimistic. Victor Jackson has political connections, and his company employs half the town. If he pushes, he'll get his way. Then we document everything, Dr. Chen said with determination. Every interaction, every decision these animals make. If we're witnessing the emergence of new behavioral patterns, the scientific community needs to know. As dawn broke the following morning, the forest awakened to the distant rumble of heavy machinery. The Jackson Timber Company convoy was moving out, a line of trucks and equipment heading toward the North Ridge along the route their scouts had mapped the previous day. Victor Jackson rode in the lead vehicle, his expression set in determined lines. Beside him, Mike the foreman looked considerably less comfortable. Are you sure we shouldn't take one of the alternate routes the rangers suggested? Mike asked cautiously. They seemed pretty concerned about those bears. Victor's jaw tightened. That harvester represents $1 million investment, Mike. Every day it sits damaged is costing us thousands. The alternate routes would add 2 days minimum to the operation. But if there's an aggressive bear, then our security team will handle it. Victor cut him off, gesturing to the third vehicle in the convoy where 2 men with tranquilizer rifles rode. We have all the necessary permits for wildlife management if it comes to that. Unknown to the timber company, a network of observers had been positioned along their route. Dr. Chen, Dr. Patel and several rangers equipped with cameras and recording equipment had taken positions that offered good visibility while maintaining safe distances. Remote cameras had been hastily installed overnight at strategic points, while drones were prepared for aerial observation. What no human observed was the early morning activity of the bear family. Long before the timber convoy began to move, Magnus had led Clara and Rusty away from their usual territory, traveling along routes that seemed deliberately chosen to avoid human contact. Shadow, the lone wolf, continued his mysterious surveillance, keeping a consistent distance from the bears while avoiding detection himself. His behavior remained a puzzle, not hunting, not threatening, simply watching. By mid-morning, the timber convoy had reached the point where their scouts had encountered the bears the previous day. They proceeded cautiously, the security team alert for any sign of wildlife. But the clearing was empty, no bears in sight. "See? Nothing to worry about," Victor declared as they passed through without incident. "Bears are smart enough to avoid humans and machinery." What he didn't know was that Magnus, Clara, and Rusty hadn't fled the area entirely. Instead, they had circled around, traveling parallel to the convoy's route, but remaining deep in the forest where the sound and scent of humans were muffled by dense vegetation. Dr. Chen, tracking the bears from a distance, narrated her observations into her recorder. "The bears are displaying what appears to be strategic movement. They're maintaining awareness of the human activity while keeping adequate distance for safety. This isn't random flight behavior. It appears calculated." The convoy continued its journey toward the damaged harvester, the noise of their passage echoing through the forest. Birds fell silent as they approached. Small mammals darted for cover, and the usual business of the woodland paused in the face of this intrusion. At the sight of the damaged harvester, Victor Jackson surveyed the scene with a critical eye. The massive machine had been partially buried by the landslide, its hydraulic systems compromised. Dark fluid stained the earth beneath it, the beginning of the leak that had justified their emergency access. "Let's get this cleaned up quickly," he ordered. "I want the harvester ready for transport by sundown." The workers moved efficiently, attaching cables to the buried portions of the machine, using smaller equipment to clear debris, and preparing containment systems for the leaking hydraulic fluid. The operation was professional and focused, despite the remote location and difficult conditions. About a quarter-mile away, hidden in a dense thicket, the bear family had stopped to rest. Magnus sat upright, his head raised to catch scents on the breeze, while Clara nursed Rusty. The cub seemed oblivious to any danger, secure in his mother's care and the unexpected protection of the massive male bear. Dr. Chen, who had followed the bears rather than staying with the timber operation, watched this peaceful domestic scene with wonder. "The family unit remains intact despite the environmental pressure," she whispered into her recorder. "No signs of stress-induced separation or abandonment behaviors." As the day progressed, the timber company's work continued without wildlife incident. The harvester was gradually excavated, the hydraulic leak contained, and preparations for transport began. Victor Jackson's mood improved with each successful step of the operation. "We'll be out of here by nightfall," he told Ranger Wong, who had been assigned to monitor the operation. "No harm done to your precious wildlife." Wong's reply was interrupted by an urgent call on her radio. She listened intently, her expression growing serious. "We need to wrap this up faster," she said as she lowered the radio. "There's a weather alert. Another storm system is moving in, more severe than predicted. Flash flood warnings for the entire watershed." Victor scowled at the sky, which had indeed begun to darken with approaching clouds. "We're almost done. 2 hours max and we're out." "The storm's moving faster than expected," Wong insisted. The access road you came in on will be impassable if the rain hits as hard as they're predicting. You need to get your heaviest equipment moving now." The urgency in her voice convinced him. Victor immediately began reorganizing the operation, prioritizing the removal of the largest vehicles and equipment. The harvester, now freed from the landslide debris, was quickly prepared for transport. As the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, the convoy reorganized for departure. The largest trucks led the way, with the damaged harvester secured to a flatbed trailer in the middle of the line. Smaller vehicles brought up the rear, with Victor and Mike in the last truck to ensure everyone made it out safely. The rain intensified quickly, turning the access road into a treacherous, muddy track. The lead vehicles navigated carefully, their powerful engines straining against the increasingly difficult conditions. Progress slowed to a crawl as visibility decreased and traction became a constant challenge. Back at the ranger station, the weather radar showed a massive storm cell moving directly over the park. "This is going to be worse than the last one," the meteorologist warned. "The ground is already saturated from previous rainfall. We're looking at significant flash flood potential in all the low-lying areas." Ranger Daniel immediately began organizing emergency response teams. "Get everyone off the trails," he ordered. "Full evacuation of all campgrounds near water. And someone find out where Dr. Chen is. She's somewhere out there with those bears." As the storm intensified, Dr. Chen found herself in an increasingly dangerous situation. The route back to the ranger station would take her across a section of forest that was prone to flooding. Staying in place risked being trapped if the waters rose. She made the difficult decision to seek higher ground, even though it meant losing track of the bears temporarily.